Good to go.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. So the launch of Visualizing Women in Science has been a long time coming. So it really is with great pleasure that I introduced two of my wonderful colleagues who have been so instrumental to the development of this project. Serenity Sutherland is Assistant Professor of Communications Studies at SUNY Oswego and holds a PhD in history and was an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in Digital Humanities at the University of Rochester. So she first came to the APS as a Digital Humanities Fellow way back in 2018, just when the Center for Digital Scholarship was sort of just getting off the ground. Serenity had this great idea to visualize correspondence networks of women scientists found within the collections of the APS. So over the course of a month-long fellowship, she worked to build out a data set of women scientists, while my colleague Cynthia Hyder and I built out a prototype of what this visualization could look like. At the end of the fellowship in 2019, we then decided that this would be a great project for us to continue to collaborate on and for the APS to support. But then because of certain world events, we weren't able to pick the project back up until the spring of 2022, just last year, when Serenity returned to the APS to refine and expand on the data set. When she returned, we had a brand new member to the Women in Science team, Digital Project Specialist David Nelson. David came to the APS from the University of Pennsylvania, where he received his PhD in Germanic languages and literatures with an emphasis on digital humanities and the history of material text. David got right to work, dove in, creating a new data structure for the project, and then he and Serenity created a more robust data set, which would eventually feed into the network visualization, which is the core of this project. The two of them have worked tirelessly ever since, and I don't think I could be more excited to now hand it over to them so they can tell you all about the great work they did in this project that we're launching today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bayard, and thank you for the very nice introduction. Thanks to everyone for coming today. Before we really launch into talking about the project, I do want to reiterate how fantastic it's been to collaborate with all the folks at the APS, particularly David and Bayard. So thank you both so much. So let's go ahead and get started. We do have some visuals that we're going to share with you here for a little bit before we launch into showing you what this site looks like and the cool things that you can do with it. So this project, as Bayard said, came out of a fellowship and an idea that I had to begin to show the connections between women in science that in a digital format, something that could be interactive, that users could go into and really play around with and see these connections. And you can go to the next slide. Thank you, David. And alongside of having this great tool, this great digital humanities tool that people could interact with and explore, I also wanted to contribute to the scholarship of women in science. And as I saw it, there were a couple of key ideas that I thought a network visualization might be able to address. So the first one is that historians of women in science have long said that women's access to science was exclusionary. They were there more times throughout history than other times. They had access due to world events such as world wars or other events than other times, but for the most part, exclusionary access is what characterized their participation in science. But even knowing that, women have always been doing science, whether or not it's in institutions, such as institutions of higher learning or laboratories. They have always been doing science, either helping husbands or working in their kitchens, or even doing their own scientific experiments. And I wanted to see how, when we place these institutionalized science in conversation with these scientists who are working maybe in fields like home economics or fields like child nutrition, what would that look like when we begin to see the overlaps? And then, going along with this, I thought that, when I was writing my dissertation, which was a biography of Ellen Richards, who was a chemist, she was one of the first women to go to MIT in the 1870s. I began to see that the story was about more than just Ellen Richards. There were all these other women who supported her and who helped her, and men as well, who helped her meet her scientific objectives, to get access to a laboratory that she was able to collaborate with. So I wanted to begin to recover some of these stories of scientists, women scientists who maybe aren't as well known, or really we don't know too much about, or haven't even perhaps encountered in the archives so far. And I thought that this could kind of resist one of the major the major undercurrents in the history of women in science, which is to present these sort of great women of science models, or hero models of women in science, that they somehow worked alone or worked by themselves, or you know, they were one of few women. What we see, in fact, when we look at the network, is there were many women who were working together with scientific goals and objectives. And so these were really the major contributions that I was hoping to make with the visualization. And yes, we can go to the next slide. Thank you, David. So at the APS, as Bayard mentioned in his intro, there are so many fantastic collections related to women in science. Some of these collections are specifically the women's letters. So for example, there's 5 collections at the APS that I worked with that were centered from the women who are writing letters, or receiving letters, or publishing, or corresponding in certain ways, some manuscript material that was related to these women. And so the 5 collections that I focused on during my time at the APS as a fellow were Florence Rena Sabin, Florence Barbara Siebert, Barbara McClintock, Mildred Cohn, and Rose Mooney Slater. And so what my process was in going through all of these was to read through these letters, you know, page by page, oftentimes not typed, you know, oftentimes these are handwritten letters, and read through and begin to put the connections together of who women were writing to. There were many instances in the collections of women writing, asking for advice, writing to other women scientists, asking almost as a mentorship relationship, or writing to scientists asking for letters of recommendation, or women receiving letters of recommendation about other women. And so this, to me, seemed to be that there's these consistencies within the collections that we could begin to map if we were to track these data points. And so as I began reading through, I would take down notes every time I noticed this kind of connection occurring between the women scientists. So for example, I might see that Florence Siebert, who worked on tuberculosis research, might have been writing to a chemist, or might have been writing to someone who was a doctor and was actually on the ground floor and working with patients. And so when I would see those connections, I would note them and note the nature of their connection. Were they corresponding? Were they recommending each other? Were they asking for advice? Perhaps even they were working on a publication together, or they were talking about their work in a laboratory together. And so this really characterized the data that I gathered, and began what I noted was the connections between these women. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, David Nelson, who's going to tell you a little bit about his role into thinking about this project.
Thank you, Serenity. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of where history of science fits in at the APS and where this project fits into that. So the APS has numerous collections in the history of science. It's the largest collection area by size. We just heard that we had 5 papers of women scientists. We actually have more than that, but those are the 5 that we were able to include in this project. We oftentimes say that we collect history of science from Newton to NASA. So there's something there for everyone who's interested in history of science. We have the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, one of whom is Barbara McClintock, who is featured in this project quite heavily. And our strongest holding areas are biomedical sciences, genetics, and physics. And all of those are also represented in this project. We have for the biomedical sciences, Florence Sabin, Florence Siebert, Mildred Cohn. Genetics is, of course, Barbara McClintock. And for physics, we have Rose Mooney Slater. So this project is in some ways a microcosm of the larger collections we have. But one of the problems we have is, of course, just as women scientists are not always well represented in the history of science, women scientists are not always that easy to find in our collections or always highlighted in such an obvious way. And so even though we have 5 papers of women scientists, it's still sometimes hard to find them. This project attempts to address that in some ways. I'm going to talk about a few examples of what I mean here. For example, and I've chosen papers here that are that have been processed quite a while ago that have some problems with them that we know about. We have the papers of Warren Lewis, who was an APS member, and he was a cellular biologist. And Warren Lewis was married to Margaret Reed Lewis, who is a very important figure that we discovered in the work of this project. She corresponded with Florence Sabin and Florence Siebert, and she was a cellular biologist like her husband, who was probably the first person to grow mammalian tissue in vitro. So an enormously important person for the history of science, who worked almost her whole life with her husband. So we have her husband's papers, and we can see here from our finding aid that we mentioned these papers concern the cytology research of Warren Lewis himself and also his wife, Dr. Margaret Reed Lewis. But her contributions are not always evident in these papers. If you actually look through them, which I was doing yesterday, you'll find interspersed with his letters are her letters as well. And it's not easy to distinguish between the two because they did everything together, but there's also not really a whole lot of evidence of that. And so this project tried to find moments like that that we could highlight and then we could show where women's contributions are. I can give you another example of a woman's, so that's an example of a woman who is present in the archive, but whose contributions are not immediately evident, whose contributions have to be worked through a little bit. We have another example of somebody who is present in the archive, but maybe is broken up amongst multiple collections. And so you don't necessarily know immediately where to find information about her. That would be Isbell Morgan. Isbell Morgan, we have a small but important collection of her own personal papers. She was a virologist whose work contributed to the development of the polio vaccine. So again, enormously important person. We have a small collection of her own papers, but in the Peter Olitsky papers, we have several journals of her research notes from when she was a much younger scientist. We also have a very small collection of her father's papers, Thomas Hunt Morgan, and there's financial records related to the estate in there, which are very important. If you were trying to write a biography, of her, you would need access to those papers. And so we have these women scientists who are present in our archive, but are not always the easiest people to find in some way. And so this project, in many ways, attempts to come to terms with that. So that leads us sort of to what we tried to do with this. Serenity had her original data model, and we wanted to turn this into a network visualization. So what did we do? We took Serenity's notes and we found those connections that were documented in the APS collections, and we made those the basis. We then surveyed our collections broadly for those women who Serenity had identified originally in the core 5 papers of women scientists. We searched for any possible connection, and many of these are the types of connections that Serenity found. Some of them are a bit more inferred, like people mentioning they were having dinner with people, or seeing that people worked at the same institution. But we surveyed over 60 collections to find any type of connection. And then we recorded data about the connection. What letter did we find it in? What collections are these women featured in, besides just the one where the connections show up? And then we recorded enhanced biographical data about each scientist so that we could find out more information about where there might be overlaps between women scientists and begin to reconstruct the broader field of women's contributions to science. So the important ones for us were the fields that they were active in, which we took a very broad approach to. Their education, where were they educated, every institution that we could record, and also their affiliations. What institutions did they work at and who did they work with? So with that, we were able to make a network visualization, which is what we are about to show you. So here we go, going live. So this is our landing page for the website, and we are going to launch directly into the network visualization that we created. And Serenity is going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing here while I drive visualization.
Thanks, David. So we're going to undertake this true task of teamwork where I'm going to narrate and David's going to follow along, which will be symbolic for our fantastic collaboration. So the heart of the project is the visualization. So that's where we're going to start. In a little bit, though, as part of our demo, we'll back out of the visualization and you'll get to see the other features of the site. But right now we are in the visualization, and I'm going to just point out here the 5 large dots that you can see on the screen that are color coded. We have a yellow dot that's very large. This is Florence Sabin's network. We have a peach colored dot that's also a little bit larger, Florence Siebert's network. We have a bright blue dot, and this is Mildred Cohn's network. And then the hunter green dot, this is Barbara McClintock's network. And the minty green dot is Rose Mooney Slater's network. So you can see these networks kind of forming around a key individual, but also you can probably see from the color coding and the connections of the lines that there is some interplay between each individual person's network. Actually, there's a lot of interplay. And so we actually, so much so interplay that we actually came up with a few colors that symbolized a large network outside of just these 5 women's networks that we were able to put together with the data. So we're going to go ahead and start showing you what some of these connections look like, along with the theme of recovering women scientists that we might not have known anything about or just a little bit about, and sort of the power of what the network can do in recovering some of these stories. So David, I'm going to give you the difficult task of trying to choose Consuelo Vadia. And David's going to search for her, which is very wise because we'd be clicking all over the place if we tried to find her on our own.
Came prepared.
So, yes, very prepared. So David has searched for this specific scientist in our search feature. And if we click on her node and then click on her biography, we can see a little bit more about her. And this is a scientist that I had never heard of and didn't know anything about. And we were unable to find a picture of her. However, we have this great document in the APS collections that tells all about what she was trying to do. She was from the Yucatan and she wanted to study in the United States. And she was able to win a fellowship through a women's association who promoted women in science to fund her study here in the United States. And she studied gynecology and then took that knowledge and was able to treat and save the lives of many women in her home country. So this is just one kind of example of the stories that we're able to tell and that you're able to view as a user reading through her biography. But if we're looking at Consuelo Vadia's larger network, another person she's connected to is Catherine McHale. So if we click on her, you can begin to see how we're stepping through the network. And if we go to the little learn more about this person option, we see we have this image of her that tells us a little bit more about her and the fields that she contributed to. If we go along in the network next to Hertha Sponer, we can learn more about her, clicking on her visualization and see the connections between the people. And then Janet Howell Clark is the next one that we'll walk along to. So the network begins to change and expand to show who's connected to whom as we walk through them. And what we see very interesting is Janet Howell Clark, who we couldn't find an image for, is connected to a more well-known woman of science, Barbara McClintock. And so I think that this is a really great example of how the network shows the lineages between women in science, whether or not they corresponded with each other, they studied under one another, that there were actually connections that we can trace as we go through the visualization. And I think that was what I was going to talk about. I did want to talk about one other thing is in the Mildred Cohn collection, kind of show that, this visualization is able to do these really cool kind of pathways that I was showing, but it's really based on what the archive has to offer. And so even though a woman in science might have been really, really prestigious, if she is not mentioned in the archive or in the APS archive, or only mentioned once, her significance isn't going to be as highly on display as someone else. So for example, Mildred Cohn was connected to Gertie Corey, who was a really well-known scientist who actually won the Nobel Prize, but she shows up here as just a tiny node and a tiny connection because it's based off of the women's correspondences rather than necessarily their prestige in the field.
Thank you. I think I'll talk about a few aspects of the network next. I did also want to highlight that when possible, we included photos from the APS collection. So in some cases, we have very nice photos, such as this beautiful vacation photo of Rose Mooney Slater, or we also have this very lovely photo of Lisa Meitner. So we tried to, where we could, include interesting photos that would tell you something a little bit more about the person, their personality, and also would feature our collections in some way. The afternoon sun is slowly turning me into a ghost, so you'll have to bear with me a little bit on the visual here. So one thing that we also want to be able to do is we also want to be able to use this so that people could experience the collections in a different way and sort of get large scale pictures of what's available in our collections and what we have. So we allow people to search via a collection, and these are the collections that the women are in. So that means we have some mention of the woman scientist in this collection. It does not mean the connection is found there. The connections are not dependent on collections. Those are, did we find a connection somewhere? So we can look, for example, at Barbara McClintock and see all the women who are represented in her papers. And we see most of these are people coming from Barbara McClintock's Hunter Green network, but we also have people like Maxine Singer, who sort of falls in between Mildred Cohn's network and Barbara McClintock's, and also Beatrice Mintz, who is more associated with a different part of the network as well. But we can see here all these people represented, and again, click through to find their connections. We also included the collection of male scientists or other history of science collections where we found these women's names mentioned. And sometimes this reveals quite interesting things. So I'm just going to pick here Evan Chargaff, because I just think this is kind of an interesting little subset of the network. We don't see many people showing up here, but we can see we have people from all different parts of the network showing up. We have Florence Siebert, Barbara McClintock, people who don't interact together in our network, but we can see nonetheless how a collection like Chargaff might be speaking to their experiences and how a researcher might come in and begin to use these types of collections. And again, we see it shouldn't surprise us that Barbara McClintock is well represented here if you know the history of this collection, but this is just a different way of experiencing the collection, of seeing what we have to offer, and also seeing the connections between these women. If we included Chargaff as a node in the network, which we didn't because we didn't include very many men, we can talk about that in the Q&A if there's questions about that. We would see that all these women would be connected by 1 degree. So it's just a different way of showing those types of connections and showing where there's overlap between these scientists. We also allow people to search by field, and fields were constructed quite broadly, so we tried to be inclusive here. Some people may be overrepresented in certain fields, but we just wanted to be inclusive here so that you could see as many people as possible. So we can look, for example, at a field like pathology. And again, we get a nice little sub-network around Florence Sabin. We see also here some people connected to, this color is Florence Siebert's network. Florence Siebert was not a pathologist. She was a microbiologist and biochemist. But we can see the people she worked with and how she and Sabin might be in dialogue or related. I also thought we could look at genetics, because genetics is a very important field in terms of the collections at the APS. And again, we see mostly Barbara McClintock represented, but also this purple color is another collection that we surveyed. And so we just see sort of a wide variety of how we can learn about these women and their contributions through using this tool. I think that is what we want to say about this part of the project. Am I correct, Serenity?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the rest of the project. And I'm going to start by showing you we wrote several of what we call data stories. And these are little vignettes about things we learned while constructing the data. And these bring out certain aspects of the data that wouldn't readily be obvious from looking at a visualization. So for instance, we have one about scientists who fled war and totalitarianism during the 20th century. And this tells a story of how these women ended up in these papers to the extent that we know. And as part of this, we built an interactive map, which shows you their stories. This was not totally written using the collections. We had to do outside research for this because in many cases we couldn't figure it out. Some of these women were not quite sure their stories because there just isn't a whole lot of information about them. But I'm going to show you one person here whose story we do sort of know, maybe not super well, but that is the Russian-American scientist Vera Danchikov, who is oftentimes called the mother of stem cells. So we're able to track her story. She had moved to New York and was living there since 1915. In 1927, she goes to the Soviet Union to do work, but she returns in 1929 because she was now a US citizen, and she can only stay in the US for 2 years due to her visa. 1934, she lost her job at Columbia and she went to Paris. Then she goes to Lithuania. During this time, she also visits her daughter in Moscow a lot. But then in 37, she has to go to Bratislava. She stopped getting Russian visas at this point because she was an American citizen. So she goes to Bratislava, where she works in a lab. Then the war comes to, World War II comes to this part of the world. And so she goes to Naples. And as you might predict, then the war came to this part of the world. And she went to Switzerland. And then, of course, the US government got angry at her because she was a US citizen and she hadn't been back in the country for a while. So she had to go back to the US. And then she may have gone to Chicago. We're not certain. There's reference to her having lived in Chicago, but we can't find very much information about her. And in 1950, there's a reference to her in Switzerland again. So this shows you what we were able to uncover about these people's biography in the visual form. We also here have a letter from Danchikov in the War and Lewis papers, which I mentioned earlier, in which she describes her journey fleeing Europe. And so this page allows you to experience those types of stories. I am now going to turn it over to Serenity, who's going to discuss another one of our data stories.
Thanks, David. And I definitely encourage folks after the fact to check out these data stories. They're really, really cool. And we don't have time to go through all of them, but I will go through this next one here is called In Their Own Words. And this is a really cool part of APS's collections where they had a number of oral histories from women scientists. So, you know, after their careers were over, the women scientists were reflecting on what it was like to be a scientist and were being interviewed by oral historians. So we have those recordings and have those transcripts. And I think that it's just such a fascinating way of showing what's in an archive that's really multimodal, that pulls in some audio features, and you actually get to hear the emotion in the women's voices, which is just fantastic. So we're going to get to listen to one of them today, hopefully, pending the technology is working with everyone hearing audio. So David, if you wouldn't mind pressing play, this is an interview from Barbara McClintock. We're just going to listen to a real quick clip of it. It is longer than what we'll have time for, but you can hear her cadence and her the emotion that is in her voice. And you can also listen as you're listening, look and follow along with the transcript.
Altogether, there weren't terribly many women at Cornell in those days, were there?
Sarah Ragnar, who was one, you know Sarah? She was there when I was there.
What was the ratio of women to men then?
The ratio was kept constant as 4 men to 1 woman.
Okay.
And the women were very much resented at Cornell. There had been a tradition. And they put up when I was a grad student, first part of a grad student, they put up a student union. And most of it was for men. And a tiny little section at one end of the building was for women. And that had a reception room, 2 small reception rooms, and a restaurant, and a ladies' room. The rest of the building women weren't allowed to go into. They charged dues for that building for everybody at the same rate, and I refused to pay them. And nobody ever said a word to me about it.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't pay them.
All right, thank you so much, David. So there's a number of other interviews on the website that I encourage you to check out. But I just think there's such great examples of what it was like to be there working as a woman scientist in this world of partial inclusion and exclusion. So kind of wrapping up here, thinking about what this project can do. There's a lot there on the site that I hope everyone will have a chance to check out on their own. I want to spend some time talking about kind of the care that David and I have taken with the site to be really careful about what we're promising the site can do or what we're promising the network visualization can do. And there are some limitations to what a project like this can do. First and foremost, the network visualization that you're seeing captures a large swath in time. It's capturing decades of women working in science and place, capturing a lot of different places and spaces, as David's map showed you, that he was showing you of Vera going around from place to place. And so the network visualization is a static representation. And we do have to keep that in mind as we're considering these connections between the women scientists. We also need to keep in mind the changing nature of communication technology. So the earlier part of the archival materials that I was looking at with Florence Sabin was very much paper-based. People were still sending letters for everything, just little quick one-liners they would send to say, oh, I can't go to this event, or oh, I'm going to be arriving at this time in Chicago's train station. That changed, of course, as we moved through the century, where a lot of those that material was communicated via telephone or even telegram in some of the cases that we saw. So the changing nature of communication technology means that some collections just had a lot more information in them. We also had one collection that, interestingly, there was a fire that wiped out a lot of the collection. So not all collections that we are looking at are necessarily created equal in terms of what's there and how they communicated. So we do have to do our best to recover that and keep that in mind when we're looking at the visualization, that there are some limitations in place in terms of what we can know. But I think some things that the visualization does really well, that it does afford users the opportunity to go in and make discoveries on their own as they're clicking through the visualization. So I think this is a really great project for scholars who are looking to start maybe a research question and aren't quite sure where to begin. This could maybe get some of those research questions moving. I also think that it would be really great for college level or high school level students to use to see some of these stories that they might not typically hear of in their textbooks. So the visualization has a number of affordances that we think really make it shine, as long as we also keep in mind some of those limitations as well.
And now I'm just going to conclude our presentation by talking a little bit about where this project fits into how we think about digital projects at the APS. And I think that Serenity gave me a really great segue here, and that this is something that we view as a jumping off point for researchers and researchers who are trying to use our history of science collections. This gives them a different way of interacting with our collections, a different way of seeing which collections are in dialogue with each other or which ones are not. If you're writing, about somebody like Barbara McClintock here, of course you would look at her papers, but you'd also want to look at the Kurt Stern papers and a bunch of other papers. If you're looking at a smaller woman who's not well documented, then that becomes even more of an imperative. And we've uncovered some women here that we didn't necessarily expect to uncover in certain papers. For example, we found people who worked with Florence Siebert, who just kept on working at the University of Pennsylvania where Siebert was. And then when Mildred Cohn showed up, they were still there. And if you were going to think about these women, you would need to access both papers, but that may not be readily available, readily apparent to you, or even the data may not exist in the first place. So by putting this data out there in this form, we're hoping that it gives researchers a bit of an idea of how you might use our collections in dialogue with each other if you were going to look at individual scientists. One thing that I'm really excited about with this, though, also is how it gives us sort of a big picture overview of some of our collections and some of the ways that we can look at it through things like, and also not just our collections, but the history of science itself. Obviously at the APS, we do have some papers from the history of science and some not. We can argue about whether it's a representative sample or not, but certainly we can see large scale trends with this type of thing. One thing you see really clearly in this network is a bunch of people who were trained as anatomists or other people who had medical school training working with Florence Sabin. And over time, this network transforms into the people working with Florence Siebert and Mildred Cohn. And these two people are biochemists who are not trained in medical schools. They end up working in medical schools, but they have a different sort of relationship to the academy. And we see how over time science changes, how over time these things evolve. And I think that using a network visualization like this to look at sort of big picture questions about, well, what's going on long-term in the history of science? What's going on long-term in our collections is very interesting and very exciting. And I think there's a lot of things that we can answer both with this and also with future projects that might build on the work that we've done here. So we are very happy to be launching this. We're very excited to see what everyone thinks about this. And with that, I think we're going to conclude our portion of this panel.
Great, thank you both so much. I think I'm constantly blown away by this project, and every time visualization opens, my jaw drops. And then the excitement of exploring it begins. So I'm really delighted that we were able to share a link in the chat with the project itself. So if you are dying to check out the data yourself, start exploring that now if you'd like to. But it's also great if you pay attention to the Q&A to round out this this program today. And luckily, we have a couple of questions already flowing into the Q&A boxes, so I don't have to worry about filling time today. The first question is, did you find any documentation related to or from women in mathematics or logic?
We did find some women related to mathematics. We were going to talk about, if this came up, one of the women who's in the network is Emmy Noether. You could probably go and search for her yourself and see like what her connections are. But I'm not sure. I don't believe that you can narrow by mathematics, David. I'm not sure that that's one of the fields, but you may be able to get some information about who was surrounding Emmy Noether by looking in the visualization. And I see the second part of Giselle's question was about, are all the women scientists exclusively from North America? And they're not. We did try to be we did try really, really hard to emphasize the transnational connections between women in science, and there's actually a data story on that. So hopefully you can play around with that and look at that on your own after the presentation.
I did just check. We did include some mathematicians. A lot of the mathematicians were not. The collections are not super, they don't speak super well to that, but we do have some material from Emmy Noether, who was very important in Florence Sabin papers. Not a whole lot of stuff that she wrote herself, but some. Dorothy Rynch appears in the Sabin papers as well as in the Lindo Patterson papers. And then also there's a very close friend of Rosemary Slater's who is a mathematician who appeared quite a bit. There's quite a lot of correspondence with her as well.
Excellent. Okay, and then the next one is, I'll pitch this as two kind of connected questions. What constitutes a connection? Is it a single instance, or does it have to be mentioned more than once? And how did you include, or what were your criteria for including men in those connections?
So I'm laughing at the second question only because that's one we've gone back and forth on quite a bit. But I'll answer the first question. So a connection just constitutes those data parameters that I had put in the slide. And really for me, it was when a woman was mentioned in the letters, I really wanted to note that. So I did have for a long time kind of a catch-all category that wasn't very helpful for refining the data or being very specific, which was just mentioned in letters to try and capture women's names and recover those names to the history of science. in terms of deciding which men to feature, we really took the tack of, if we featured this connection, this connection with a man, how would it change the network visualization? Because we really wanted it to be about women's networks in science, and sometimes those networks were impossible to see unless men were in the collection. For example, someone like Britton Chance, who was really doing, there was a lot of information about women in his papers. And another really interesting connection is Albert Einstein actually shows up in the visualization because he wrote a letter of recommendation for a woman scientist. So we kind of asked ourselves, in what ways does including this particular person really build out the network and tell the story about women in science that we're trying to tell?
Yeah, I have just two things to add on that. The first thing about the men is that, we realized very early on that if we included every connection related to a man, that this would marginalize women, because there would just be so many connections amongst all the men, and they would become the largest circles in the network, and we didn't want to do that. So it is selective, but we tried to pick people who had sort of a rationale or a story to tell, as Renee just said. Early on with the connections, I tried to sort of get us to define them more correctly, and we realized very quickly what a fool's errand that was, because it's just from the evidence we have, sometimes it's difficult to say, they corresponded. How many years did they correspond for? Well, they corresponded heavily between 1910 and 1915, and then there's no letters until 1940. What does that mean? So it's really, we tried to, if we can tell they had a relationship, we tried to include it as much as we could.
That's a mind-boggling task in and of itself. So another question is, have you digitized the letters or pieces of material that have mentioned the women covered in the project? And if so, are there plans to get them transcribed?
So we did digitize selectively some of the material. We digitize. So this is an ongoing problem with our history of science collections, is that there's so much paper. A folder can have 100 pieces of paper in it. So some people, there's like 10 folders, and just the hours and the storage space it takes to digitize all that is a little bit beyond it's a lot. So we did selectively digitize some material. It is in the process of being uploaded and will be available to you. But some very important correspondence around Florence Sabin and her work with the Naples Table Association, which we wrote a data story about, has been digitized and is available. There will be some information coming up in the next few weeks, hopefully, about Florence Siebert and tuberculosis. So we didn't digitize everything, but we tried to digitize things that told important stories about the network. We would have loved to digitize more, but unfortunately, it's just not the time to get all of that paper, all those hundreds of sheets of paper digitized.
Yeah, and actually on that note about the labor, that goes into putting these things online, it is a lot of work, even just the process of digitization. But we would certainly be remiss if we did not mention that we had some tremendous help in writing the biographies for the scientists. There are about 310 entries in this visualization, about 280 of them, or some number around there. It's changing now and then, but a large number of people to write biographies for. And we had just some really great help from some graduate assistants. Mackenzie Mahoney at SUNY Oswego, who worked with me over a couple semesters, wrote a lot of them. We have also intern at the APS, Graziella Pierangeli. I'm sorry, Graziella, if I ruined your last name, who helped us with these biographies, because it was just too much for a few select people to take on their own. We've had so much work from just people even at the APS reading room who would know that I was interested in this topic, and they would come down and say, oh, we just got this interesting collection. There's this woman mentioned, she's connected to this woman. Does she fit in the visualization? So those kinds of really generous labor that folks contributed to the visualization that I'm really grateful for.
Yeah, it's part of the daunting thing of opening the site in and of itself. You see all the dots, and then each dot has a biography, and then each biography has massive amounts of information, and then the data stories. So it's a lot going on. So it is a massive, laborious task, but it's a worthwhile one. So a great question came in. I think I saw her name as a dot on there, but within the last year, the APS acquired the papers of Beatrice Mintz or Beat Mintz. So as kind of new collections come into the APS, how will this project be able to speak to those new collections?
Well, I'm very excited to see what's hiding in B. Mintz's papers, because I'm sure that there are numerous connections there, and I haven't myself looked at them. So I'm not certain, but I know that there are things in there, because we know that she's already in correspondence with these people. It would be great to incorporate the connections that we find there in the future. It would be another sort of infrastructure task where we would need to devote labor hours to that. But it would be, interesting even just to take the correspondence and see what women are appearing there and where can we begin with this. I think it would be great to continue to build this project as we continue to go. If the resources and things continue to move for that, because what we've uncovered is only the tip of the iceberg, I think. So yeah, more coming.
But if you need your B. Mintz fix, some of her materials that were acquired by the APS will be included in the upcoming exhibition, Pursuit and Persistence, which again opens on March 31st. It's a pretty exciting portion of the exhibition that she's in. So another Q&A question that rolled in is, when you were researching women and their personal lives, what did you find to be the best resources for finding information about them in particular? And did most of that information directly come from the APS collections?
A lot of the information came from the APS collections, because so many of the women scientists that we found in the archive, I mean, not that we found them, they've always been there, but that we uncovered while we were doing our research, there would be a story about them in the letter. So we had to note the story, and so we would have like maybe a really brief story to go off of. So something like Consuelo Vadillo was trying to come to the United States, but the funding she thought she had, she wasn't sure she was going to get. And so, and you have to imagine this is during the time when it takes a lot of time for letters to go back and forth. And so she's kind of left hanging, not sure if she's coming. And so we just get little snippets like that. And we also learned in that letter that she's interested in gynecology. And so then, once we start researching, maybe there would be an article out there that mentions her, or one resource might be something like Find a Grave. If we can see like what her birth and death dates were, can we track down more information about her? Things on Internet Archive or other places that have other finding aids at other repositories that might mention someone's name briefly, we can begin to piece this detail together. But when we were writing biographies, it could be really frustrating because you would spend a lot of time trying to build out one person's story based on just a line of information.
Yeah, and other sources that we consulted were published registers of graduates of institutions, just so we could like figure out where they were. Articles that they had published, if they had the affiliations in them, were very useful. Just something that we could get something more robust. If somebody had an obituary, then I was very, very, very happy. That was a good day for me, because that bio was going to be really easy to write. But yeah, a lot of them, it was really trying to reconstruct evidence from shreds, and unless the collections had information on them, which they occasionally did, like in the case of Consuelo Vadillo.
I think that part is too, like, such an exciting part of the project too overall, especially from education programs where teachers still assigned that do a biography of a scientist project, and the fact that a resource like this exists out there that is not Wikipedia is kind of fantastic, especially considering that a lot of these might not be featured on something like Wikipedia or even have that very findable obituary. So it's a great resource overall. Okay, so this one's okay, so I think I understand this. So this project tackles the social roles of humans between humans, but overall in the history of science, there are some important connections to be made between humans and either the tools or kind of the non-human actors in the field, like rats, rabbits, things like that. Do you see this project being able to speak to something like those other non-human connections, or do you think that's a possible area of further research that this can inspire?
I can start this one, Serenity. I'm sure you have.
Go
I'm
ahead.
sure you have lots of thoughts. This was not something, this is not something we track specifically. It would be interesting to track. A lot of these people are connected via institutions, which are, maybe semi-human agents. We didn't necessarily track like people sharing equipment, although that oftentimes happens. There's a lot of correspondence where people are interested in sharing rats, because they need a stock of rats or something. There are a lot of cases in which we know there's correspondence about instruments that we know they're sharing, but in all these cases, the sharing produces correspondence. We didn't look at cases where maybe somebody's using a stock of rats that somebody made that gets moved on, that we couldn't find correspondence for. I think that would actually produce very interesting connections. They're just somewhat outside of the scope of this project at this point, although there's maybe a few examples.
Yeah, David, that's right. I was getting excited about this question because I am very interested in the overlap between humans and animals, and you certainly see that in this project. So much so that it was almost really sad sometimes to be in the reading room. I am a huge animal lover, and to be reading about the way that the scientists would talk about the rabbits and the lab rats, and there's certainly something there that could be traced. One of the most interesting stories that I encountered was at the Jackson Laboratory in Maine. There was a collection of mice that were there and that they used in their research. And unfortunately, there was a fire that went through the entire, the whole region. There was a massive fire, and all of the mice, all of their specimens perished in the fire. So there's a lot of interesting stories about that. And then that had ramifications because scientists would write to the laboratory asking for their specific mice because they were specific and were built into people's experimentations. And so that actually caused a pause in a lot of projects people weren't able to consider to continue because they weren't getting the mice. So your point there is really good, that there's a lot of ways in which there are other actors in this network that aren't human. But yeah, as of right now, we don't have that as part of our scope, but I can certainly see that being part of it.
Okay, so we only have time for one last question, so I'm trying to read if I can combine any of these in possible ways. I think I'll just end on a very fun one of sorts. Are there any aspects of the project that ended up on the cutting room floor that you hope to one day revisit, or which could have made it into the project?
Well, I would say not really, because my collaborators are so fantastic that even like if I had an idea at the last minute, to add the oral histories, and this was in December, and I was like, David, what if we add the oral histories? And he was like, okay. So I think that I've been really lucky that not too much has been left on the cutting room floor in terms of like we haven't done things that we could have done. There are things that we could do in the future if we had more time and more resources, but they're not things that we've already done that we cut. They're just avenues for the potential of things we could do in the future if we wanted to. That would be my answer. David, yours might be a bit different.
I largely agree. I think there are some women's names that we had to cut at a certain point because we couldn't find any information about them before our deadline. And I would like to reincorporate some of them, maybe at some point in the future when we have more information. At one point, we wanted to write something maybe about crystallography, because that's a really important sub part of this network. And it's something that there's not a whole lot of accessible information about there. So that would have been nice to have, especially because it speaks to some of those scientists maybe who are, like Rosemary Slater was a crystallographer. She was the first woman X-ray crystallographer in the United States. And she's just not really well known, and we have her papers, and it'd be great to highlight her. But we just, that's something maybe in the future we can revisit and try to create something accessible for a broader audience as part of this.
So thank you both so much again for presenting on this, and of course the labor and everybody else's time and energies that went into this project. We at the APS are over the moon to be able to present this to everybody today, and for everybody to be able to use it after this point on. And of course, I do want to do a final last-minute plug for the exhibition Pursuit and Persistence, 300 Years of Women in Science, which will feature this project, which opens at the APS Museum on March 31st, and we hope you can join us there at some point in time. That is it from us, folks. Thank you so much again for attending, and remember to check out the new digital project. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.